Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining again today for episode 4 of 5 of Structures Describing a System in Real Time. Well, let's just jump right in since we still have a lot to cover and time is running out. So, as you've grown used to, let me just share my things tags, this great little app I have. And this week, we're going to be going back to our themes and hopefully finishing those up. We went through uh, from activism to ritual over the last 2 weeks. And today, let's start with scenario planning. So, I've been interested in scenario planning for a while, maybe since the early aughts when the designer and polymath David Reinford first turned me on to Stuart Brand and I read How Buildings Learn. And more recently, since 2017 or 2018, in the wake of the last US election and really thinking about all the crises that we're encountering right now, I've been interested in trying to use the narrative and modeling technologies of scenario planning to think about how to draft potentially different futures and prototype actions together with artists, designers, and fiction writers. And I know that, for some of you, scenario planning may have a bad reputation. I mean, it was originally designed by folks in the US for military usage, and then it became very useful for corporations to try to gain a competitive advantage in the 1970s and 80s. But I actually think once you look into the methodologies of scenario planning, it's like, in my humble opinion, it's not some sort of rocket science or a magical thing or even evil, nefarious kind of technology. I mean, it just basically extends and perhaps slightly commodifies or regularizes one of the most basic of human abilities, which is the ability to project into the future and to tell stories not only about what has already happened, but what might happen. And I think this is both humankind's greatest ability and our best hope for being able to work our way through our current situation. So, science fiction. Uh, I mean, if I were showing images during this talk, which I'm not, that's one of my constraints for the most part, then I'd simply show you a childhood picture of me with a robot next to me for Halloween as a kid. And my mom, who was a software engineer and roboticist, was probably the person taking that picture. And just based on that, I think you'd understand why science fiction always just seemed like another version of the present to me. Self help. I mean, this is a quintessentially American genre, and I have to admit, I really love self help. It may not be cool to say in a room of cultured folks like you all, but I think it's a somewhat quixotic, but also open and generous way to share your own methodologies and experiences as tools for others so that others might benefit from them. I know your objection is probably going to be that, oh, well, why would we, isn't it arrogant to believe that your methods, whoever's methods, are universal or useful for everyone? And I don't think that's true. I think every self-help methodology is useful for some people. And so, I just think that, why not share your tools? Why not be open if you've reached a point of being clear about certain things in the world? And so I recently started a doc called What I've Learned from Self-Help. And most of it is like 3 lines per self-help book. I think a lot of self-help books can be summarized in just about that. But I think of this talk today over the last, 3 sessions before this and into our next and last session, I think it's a bit like pre-self-help in the way that, I would like to describe this particular self very thoroughly before I start to articulate how this self might be useful to others. Silence. Skill sharing. Every barber has a barber. Every therapist has a therapist. What if we open this up into a general economy of mutual exchange? Social dreaming. One of the many new things that I learned during the COVID-19 lockdown was social dreaming, which is a technique employed by LA-based psychologist and psychoanalyst George Bermudez, whom I was introduced to by the amazing artist Connie Samaras. And social dreaming is a fascinating technique. It's existed, as I believe, in a formalized way within the Western psychological discourse since the 80s or 90s, but it involves bringing together a group of people into a so-called matrix to share their individual dreams. Yet these dreams aren't shared as a personal property. They're shared like a kind of common intellectual cultural material that everybody has access to. And in practice, what this means over, at least or as I've experienced over the two social dreaming matrices that I took part in, and a little bit of reading I did as well about it, it involves this remarkable but actually quite common leap from the idea of an individual dreamer and her or his dreams meanings, something that you might find in, say, classical Freudian psychoanalysis, this idea of the individual's dreams. And it leapfrogs over that into the idea that dreams are shared by all members of society and they might reflect what's happening in society at large. This is not, as I understand it, something like a Jungian collective unconscious, but it is the idea that there's actually like a zeitgeist. There's something happening that's reflecting itself in our dreams. And in technique, I mean, one of the therapist practitioners who was who was helping to guide one of these matrices, he said that this actually builds on practices that are very common in non-Western and indigenous cultures, in which dreams are taken as a collective message rather than some sort of individual and interior and private one. And I mean, I think that this is quite a shift, even though it's simple. It's a change to tell and hear a dream, not as your own singular individual property, but as something that might have meaning for everyone. Somatics. Now, somatics is also a relatively new topic, not as new as social dreaming, but something I've really been exposed through people like Susan Plotz and Krista Coccioli and Emily Smith. But I'll just take a moment to do one little practice. Some of you will have seen this already on the show, but also in other contexts, that I was introduced to by the Minneapolis-based therapist and trauma specialist Resma Menakem. And it's something that he recommends particularly for what he calls bodies of culture as they enter into a new room. But he also emphasizes the importance of practice, doing it over and over again to, as he says, get the reps in. So let's do it again. So I'll just ask you to take a moment to land in your body and stare straight ahead. And just take notice of what lands in your consciousness. And then slowly, with your hips and your shoulders, I'll ask you to just turn and look over your left shoulder. And then you can come back to center. Take a deep breath. And then slowly look up. And then come back to center. And then slowly look down. And then come back to center. And now, again with your shoulders and your hips, turn and look over your right shoulder. And then come back to center. Yeah, I'm finally reading Resma Menakem's My Grandmother's Hands. I just got my hands on a copy of it, and I can't wait to get more into his practices. Speculation. So I once co-edited a book called Speculation Now together with Karen Quoney and Vijayanti Rao. Speculation comes from the Latin speculum, to see both into the future, but also to make risks, to take leaps. And sometimes I worry that I might be a little too speculative, too risky in terms of the leaps, intellectual, financial, emotional that I make. But hey, that's the spice of life. Spirituality. I mean, spirituality is not something you're really supposed to talk about in, well, at least in the circles I often run in the kind of polite art world society these days. I mean, it's a little bit different from Krista Tippett's On Being show, where her first question for her guests is usually something like, how would you characterize the spiritual or religious background of your childhood? I think it's a great question. I think it helps to answer a lot of things, but somehow it's off limits in a lot of contexts. Hopefully not in yours. But, I've recently been thinking about the Cartesian and eminently Western duality of mind and body, and how poor it seems to describe our existence. I mean, I myself believe more in trios than I do in dichotomies. And so these days, I often talk about mind, body, and spirit, with the idea that all three of those terms are indelibly interconnected. I mean, any change in one affects the other. You can't speak about one without the other. And so, the so-called West may just have developed some more, clear or better tools for observing and measuring the first two parts of the Trinity, mind and body, than it currently does for the third, although there are a lot of other cultural practices which can very, very well delve into the spiritual. And personally, since I was in high school, I mean, I was raised Hindu and I was raised with a strong set of beliefs, but they were mostly more like practices, things you did in temple, than any kind of dogmatic idea of a god or not a god. And I grew to believe less in a personified or deified notion of a god or even gods, as you have in the pantheistic Hindu faith, than I grew to believe in my teens in a kind of simple and maybe kind of inexplicable belief that there is some force in the universe that holds things together. And in my kind of belief system, this force didn't necessarily have an intentionality. I mean, it wasn't some sort of anthropomorphized set of desires, but it was something more like a reason why things even exist, why we even have this thing called consciousness, and why one set of actions results in another. And I called this God or this spirit without a face or personality. Back in the day when I was 16, I used to call it causality. It was just the force of spirit that allowed things to hold together. And years later, when I would read Hume and I would read other skeptics, I would think, oh yeah, even the idea that one thing results in another requires a certain belief. And this was where I stood, that without causality, the universe would fly apart. I can't necessarily prove this, not yet, but I think life is long and spirit is even longer. Sync, as in synchronicity. I mean, this is a new and old theme for me, like many things. It used to be a very deep part of my thinking and working, which came from having grown up playing music and being interested in rhythm. But now I recently had a conversation with the Cologne-based roboticist, artist, programmer Christian Falbel. And I added it to this list more recently since our conversations over the past weeks. And we had a great conversation in which he mentioned mirror neurons and the way in which humans can copy each other to try and be in sync with each other. But he also mentioned some new approaches in robotics to try and have circuits function like this, have circuits or robotics emulate these kind of mirror neurons where we try to do what others do. But sync in terms of being synchronized with other folks has been a fundamental question for me during COVID. I mean, on both a technical and philosophical, conceptual level, and interpersonal, ultimately social, communal. I mean, for example, how do you deal with latency in a network, a lag between people's connections? How can you actually have a conversation or engage in something together? There's a problem I know a lot of musicians are dealing with. And frankly, for me, the biggest question is not even just music. It's one of the most important things in my life, which is karaoke. Because, without proper sync, how can you do karaoke? I mean, in early March or mid-March, when we went into lockdown, that was actually my big question, was how I thought we could model social systems if we could figure out how to deal with karaoke sync. And so I started something called spontaneous group karaoke and tried to get a lot of folks to jump on WhatsApp and do karaoke together. And it was always out of time. It never quite worked. We were never one with each other, but I think it gave us the opportunity to try and be in sync. So with that in mind, why don't you join in me? Let's try a little karaoke for today. Okay. To a great song I just really started to listen to in July when I was on holiday, produced by a friend of mine, Aaron Desner. Really, really great song. Okay, let's see. Is this gonna work? Okay. You with me? Might be out of sync, that's the thing. I'm doing good, I'm on some new shit. Been saying yes instead of no. I thought I saw you at the bus stop, I didn't though. I hit the ground running each night. I hit the Sunday matinee. You know the greatest films of all time were never made. I guess you never know, never know. And if you wanted me, you really should have showed. And if you never bleed, you're never gonna grow. And it's all right now. We were something, don't you think so? Roaring 20s, tossing pennies in the pool. And if my wishes came true, it would have been you. In my defense, I have none, but never leaving well enough alone. But it would have been fun if you would have been the one. Come on, join in. Karaoke is all about doing it together. It's not about being good at it. I have a dream you're doing cool shit, having ventures on your own. You meet some woman on the internet and take her home. We never painted by the numbers, baby, but we were making it count. You know the greatest loves of all time are over now. I guess you never know, never know. And it's another day waking up alone. But we were something, don't you think so? Roaring 20s, tossing pennies in the pool. And if my wishes came true, it would have been you. In my defense, I have none, but never leaving well enough alone. But it would have been fun if you would have been the one. I persist to resist the temptation to ask you if one thing had been different. Would everything be different today? We were something, don't you think so? Rose flowing with your chosen family. And it would have been sweet if it could have been me. In my defense, I have none, but digging up the grave another time. But it would have been fun if you would have been the one. Okay, thanks all. I hope that was fun. Let's share now. Back to things. So where were we? Sync. Okay, now technology. Yeah, it's hard to get the karaoke technology to work. But yeah, you might ask me, what do you mean by technology, Prem? Sorry, that's an allergy reference. But you might say technology. This is too vague. It's not precise enough. And I mean, it's true. Like a lot of the things on these themes, technology is a pretty wide-ranging theme. It's a lot of stuff. It could mean an interest in newfangled hardware or software tools. It could mean a philosophical interest in the history and theory of extensions to the human capacity to act within the world and on the world. It could even mean the idea of spiritual technologies that you can use within the world to act upon the fabric of existence. Let's keep them all on the table at the moment. I'm interested in them. Therapy. Now, my interest in therapy was originally an academic and theoretical one. The first college course I ever took while I was in high school was a course at a local Catholic university, and it was Psych 101, Psychology 101. It was probably where I was introduced to the idea of, Pavlov and Spinner and all this stuff, behavioral stuff, but also the idea of therapy, though I don't really remember it. But maybe for some reason, maybe because of that class, maybe just because of what used books were available at flea markets and antique bookstalls in Connecticut when I was growing up in the 1980s and 90s. I mean, I ended up buying a whole bunch of books by Freud. Maybe they had good covers. I mean, from Moses and Monotheism to Civilization, Its Discontents, and others. And I read these. And then I read some more in college in my freshman year. And actually, near the end of college, one of the best courses I took, though I only audited it, unfortunately, was a class called Freud as Literature. And we performed close readings of all the major works of Freud, but not as science. Instead, we read them as pieces of literature, and in a particularly what I would think of as a really Freudian way. I mean, as a professor whose name unfortunately eludes me, or maybe I repressed it, I don't know, said in the first class, Freud is obviously a very smart guy, but in every one of his major writings, he makes some claim that clearly oversteps what he had to say to make a scientifically valid point. You might ask him, why, Sigmund, did you have to say that wild thing? I mean, you could have made a much more measured claim, and we would have stayed with you the whole time. But those particular moments where Freud oversteps are going to be the moments we look at. And it was a fantastic way to read Freud. And to be honest, the theoretical part also gave me a kind of practical way to engage with psychotherapy. I mean, for years in my 20s, as I suffered from depressive syndromes and was on these emotional roller coasters, I told myself over and over again that I didn't deserve to go to therapy. That I came from a perfectly privileged middle-class background, didn't have any major childhood traumas to contend with. Going into therapy would represent a waste of time, money, and even worse, it would be an egoistic and self-involved move that would validate the absolutely stupid notion that I deserve to spend time and money talking to somebody else about myself in confidence. And to me, this was like a very Western notion compared to the more Indian or Eastern idea of collective sharing and healing. But the only way that I could really enter into therapy was by tricking myself. I mean, my friend Damien DaCosta convinced me that it would be theoretically interesting based on my interest in Freud. And so I applied for individual psychotherapy at the William White Institute, a psychoanalytic institute on New York's Upper West Side. And, I applied because if I were accepted, I'd be working with a trainee whose rate would be extremely discounted rather than a full fee. And I thought it'd be great theoretical research. And so in January 2008, I finally decided to do it. I had my first session with a budding psychotherapist named Andrew Barry. Thank you for everything you did. And he was an older bearded man. And I believe, I might be making this up, it might be my projection, but I always thought he was an ex-Hell's Angel. Though again, he didn't talk that much about himself. But we started at $40 a session. And I never looked back. The self. So I hung out with a lot of folks in college and after college who worked on philosophy of mind and consciousness. I mean, for example, my girlfriend during my Fulbright year in Germany and after, Andrea Deeker, who, she had a tremendous intellectual impact on me, though I've never really acknowledged it. Well, she and her college friend Graham were really interested in philosophy of consciousness. I mean, I'd been exposed to some of this stuff from my friend Tim Aubrey. I'd been reading Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained and other folks, but Andrea and Graham gave me some other tools and some books to relate to. And nowadays, I'm more interested in the kind of neurological and psychological and historical constructions of the idea of the self. I'm interested in when we came up with the notion, who was we, when the notion of a kind of bounded self that's distinct from others was invented. And I've got this tome of a book on my desk that I can't wait to dig into once I'm done with this series. It's by Jerome Siegel, and it's called The Idea of the Self, Thought and Experience in Western Europe Since the 17th Century. But at the same time, I'm interested in the construction of the idea of the self because I'm also interested in the idea of exploring and ultimately exhausting the notion of the self in order to transcend these kind of limited individual ideas that we've come up with in the last, say, 400, 500 years. And, there are lots of ways that people try to escape themselves. Some people through meditation, through extreme sports, psychedelic drugs, even extreme self-isolation. And, I actually think one interesting thing I've come up against since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic is that the most isolating versions of experience often are described as a state of porosity, a state of becoming one with the world. And that's actually so similar to the most social forms of experience where you're actually with other people and you're having a conversation or completing each other's sentences. So this extreme isolation of the self and the extreme immersion of the self in others can sometimes both lead to a feeling of being more connected with others. It's also why I think art is around, but that's more for later. But that's just a little bit of a clue of what I'm trying to do here in this 5-part series. I mean, I'm trying to delve so deeply into one particular self, but so that by the end of this series, no more of its mythologies will remain. And so that hopefully I will be able to move through the world lighter and a little bit unburdened by this fixed idea of a me. And mostly, I also hope that by the end of the series, I will never want to talk about myself again, and it'll all be on the internet, and I'll be done. And I can just talk about other more interesting things in the world. Phew, it'd be so much better. Trauma. These days, I'm very compelled by people like Bessel van der Kolk or Resmaa Menakem, whom I mentioned before, and their approach to trauma, thinking about how trauma lodges in the body, how it conditions our responses to the world at large on a cellular level, but how that then scales up to perpetuate cycles of reaction and violence in the world. And, in early August, after returning from holiday with my family, I woke up one morning super early and started a new Google Doc called fiction/writing/morning pages. The morning pages being after the kind of artist self-help book, The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. The first short entry I wrote is a piece of pure fiction from the imagined perspective of my young aunt, whose name I can't even remember right now. She was the one who my 7-year-old self was deeply in love with, and she was one of the many members of my father's family who was on Air India Flight 182 when it exploded off of the western coast of Ireland en route from London to Toronto due to a terrorist bombing. When the pain comes, it's swift. One moment, she's talking with X, one seat away across the aisle and with a cup of coffee in her hand. The next moment, a noise, its location unfathomable, and then a tearing pain at the left arm. A look down, and what was once arm is now meat. A jagged, gaping hole where that part of body was, and where now instead, impossibly it must seem, there is only sky. The body, the flight, the space ripped asunder to reveal the underlying atmosphere apart. And what is most uncanny is how, nevertheless, for that one short moment before she stops being she, it is still this one set of human eyes that is looking at itself, half there and half a gaping hole in the side of existence. And then she wakes up, leaving that half-charred morsel entirely, and ascends, as Flight 182 begins its quick descent into the ocean. Typography. I used to say to people, I might still say to people, that if there's one thing in the world that I'm actually really good at, it's typography. I do a lot of different things. I do some of them pretty well. But if there's one craft in the world that I've spent my proverbial 10,000 hours doing and mastering, though mastery is a whole different problematic. But let's say, I think I'm really good at typography. It's, I've spent a lot of time over the last 20, 25 years using mechanically reproduced letters in order to arrange words and paragraphs that create shared meaning between different folks. And, after these more than 20 years of crafting typography in books, publications, posters, websites, signage, logos, and beyond, I can sometimes make typography without even thinking about it, regardless of the program or what technology is available to me. And I can look at a whole lot of typefaces and identify them almost instinctually. And I'm not saying that my typography these days is necessarily as radical or groundbreaking as it might once have been. But, everybody gets older and they get a little more settled into themselves. But I am saying that my sense of typography, and I hope it doesn't sound like a boast, but I think I'm so attuned to typography that it's a part of the way I see the world. What I would argue from that is that I think that once you become really good at making a certain kind of thing, and I don't just mean good, I mean like really good, then whether that thing is typography or writing or making exhibitions or bricklaying or hand sewing garments or gardening, I think that once you're so good that you've done your, Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours, I don't know if I buy that, but let's just say you've done it a lot. I think that once you've learned how to make a thing so well that you nearly become one with the thing you're making in certain moments, I believe that you also might possess the foundation for becoming very good at another thing, whatever it is, because you can actually see what quality means, and you can also understand what it feels like in your body to make a thing really well. And I would even go so far as to argue, I guess I'm doing it right now, that the very act of making a thing, whatever it is, extended over long enough periods of time, is a form of kind of embodied, embedded meditation that slowly but surely remakes your sense of a fixed self. And I mean, maybe it's a little bit like that famous scene in The Matrix where Neo looks behind the illusion of existence and can see the flowing streams of code that compose it, that underlie it. And, in Hinduism, we talk about Maya, the veil of illusion. And once it's pulled aside, I think all kinds of other structures become much, much clearer. Usufruct. Usufruct. Usufruct is a Latin term for the idea that if a person or the state has a property that is not being used productively, then others can use it. For example, if a field is not being tilled by its owners, then others can till it. And it's related to the contemporary idea of squatting, but it has this old provenance. And in this ancient kind of legal term, it's basically grounded in the idea that there is, I think, an abundance of resources that, if there were no hoarding and no separation of what I own versus what you own, but rather some sort of common understanding that if you have something but you don't currently use it, or you don't need it, and I might be able to use it, then it's okay for me to temporarily use it, assuming it doesn't damage it. And for some people, I mean, you might even say, I mean, I'm no agricultural specialist, but there might be a way in which I'm speculating here, but that not tilling the land and rotating crops for many years might be worse for the soil's fertility than actually having somebody use it and till the land and plant plants in a thoughtful, permacultural way. And I mean, this also ties into personal things. I mean, for many years, I have been in New York, what is euphemistically called an urban homesteader, also known as a squatter in New York. But finally, since last month, since August, after years of campaigning with the city, our building is finally legal. Woo! And I want to give a good shout out to all the folks, you know who you are, Willow and Zoe and Ted and Mario and all the folks who have made this possible over the last many years. And so for me, there's no more usufruct. It's, at least for me now, I'm still interested in the topic, but I think it's still a model for looking into the future, and thinking about ways to rethink property ownership and power structures and what we assume we can and we can't give to our fellow humans and creatures. And so here for the last of our themes, workshop and facilitation methodologies, something I'm constantly working on, thinking about, trying to develop further. I'm even doing a training in a couple of weeks with Richard Bartlett and the Hum, to think about microsolidarity. But, I just wanted to do a little demonstration of something I've been testing out these days. It's a little hard in the semi kind of monodirectional frontal way of YouTube Live to run a workshop right now. But let's try this out. It's just a little kind of exercise that I've been doing with different kinds of workshops, from strategic workshops with clients to curatorial workshops, to consulting gigs, and also even to studio visits. And so can you all just take a moment? Do you have a pen and paper around? Just see if you have a pen and paper around. That'll be really helpful. And I'll just give you a minute. You can also do this on a computer if you want to type, but writing is good. Let me just give you a moment. Grab a pen or paper wherever you are. Okay? You got it? Or get ready to type. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to intro us, and then I'm going to ask you 3 questions. And I'm just going to ask you 3 questions. Take a moment with each of them to write down the answers for yourself, so you've registered your individual response. And then when you're done, if you feel like it, put them into the chat. Just go type them into the chat in the bottom right, or you can keep them private if you prefer. But if you feel like sharing, we can do this together. So you ready? Okay. So let's start by I'm just going to ask you to, if you want, close your eyes, take a deep breath in, and then breathe out. We're just going to reset our sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Just breathe deeply in and breathe out. And let's do it a 3rd time. And then breathe out. Okay, so I'm going to ask you the first question, and just take a moment to write down quickly the answers for yourself. So I'm just going to ask you to write down the first 3 things that come to mind. 3 things that you want. Okay, hopefully that's enough time. Just put down quick thoughts. Now, I want you to just take another deep breath in and then breathe out again, slowly. Here's the second question. I want you to take a moment and write down the first 3 things that come to mind that you fear. The first three things that you come to mind that you fear. Okay. And the last one is a little bit of a longer question. Let's breathe deeply in and breathe out again. And the last one is, I just want you to take a moment to project yourself forward into the future. Let's say 5 years into the future. Think about what your day looks like, where you are, whom you're with, and how you spend your time. And I just want you to very quickly, I'm going to give you a minute, outline what activities do you do? What does your day look like? How do you spend your time? So just take a moment, and I'm just going to count and give us about a minute or so. Okay, just slowly finish whatever you're writing and pick up your pen or pencil. And usually I do give people 3 minutes, 5 minutes for that. I'm doing a little bit of a shorter version now, but you get the idea. You can do it on your own. Just make sure to breathe before, because it helps you to be in the state of mind to confront these things, state of body as well. So if you feel like it, take a moment and feel free to type anything into the chat that seems relevant or important, but don't feel you need to. We all can self-disclose however we want. Okay, well, while people are chatting, putting things into the chat, I'm gonna move to the last part of today. I'm going to go to open up a new tab, really the tab that started this whole things structure in early August. And it's the section I call activities. Administrating, analyzing, annotating, antiquing, archery, arguing, art directing, art making, beginning, being, bookkeeping, breaking up, breathing, brushing teeth, business developing, buying, calling, canceling, classifying, cleaning, closing, collecting, conceptualizing, cooking, communing, computing, concluding, consulting, continuing, correcting, counseling, counting, creative directing, crying, curating, dancing, deciding, debating, demonstrating, designing, destroying. Diagramming, dining, directing, discovering, discussing, documenting, drafting, dreaming, drinking alcohol, drinking caffeine, drinking water, drinking soft drinks, eating, editing, educating, emailing, engaging, exercising, facilitating, fighting, following. Free associating, founding, fundraising, gathering, going to the bathroom, going to therapy, hiking, hugging, inspiring, intervening, isolating, joining, journaling, killing, kissing, launching, layouting, leading, learning, leaving, lecturing. Listening, lounging, lying, maintaining, making love, making up, marketing, managing, massaging, masturbating, meditating, meeting, modeling, napping, negotiating, not smoking, observing, organizing, participating, performing. Philosophizing, photographing, pitching, playing, playing guitar, pondering, practicing, premiering, presenting, pretending, processing, programming, proofing, protesting, prototyping, punch listing, questioning, reacting, reading, reconciling, recording. Recovering, recycling, reflecting, rehearsing, relaxing, researching, responding, revising, riffing, running, saving, schmoozing. Oh, this needs one. Let's just say that a new children's book I've encountered these last couple weeks is schmoozing. It exists in German and English as well, but the German version of this book is much better. Schmoozing means to hug. And just no matter what language you speak, get yourself a copy of schmoozing. That's my advice to you. Separating, sharpening, showering, sketching, sleeping, sorting, squatting. Actually, I don't squat anymore. I guess I can delete that. I'm not a squatter anymore. Okay. staying, stretching, studio visiting, sunbathing, swimming, synthesizing, talking, teaching, team building, testing, thinking, thrifting, throwing out, traveling, truth telling, typesetting, vacationing, waiting, watching pornography, waving, weighing, withdrawing, workshopping, writing, and yelling. Okay, well, we still have a couple of sections to go: scales, modes, ways, outputs, Trinity human, three tools, three scales for art, maybe even references. But we've got one more week next week, and we'll get through as much as we can. The rest will come another time. But thanks again for joining today. I do have these rituals at the end of my sessions. Usually they involve communing in some way over music, but why don't we just take a moment to snap our fingers together? Let's just snap our fingers. Boom, 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 boom. Join in. Boom, boom. Make a beat. Boom, 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 boom. Okay. That's enough of that. Have fun, have a good week, stay safe, and see you next week.